When enslaved people in Virginia and North Carolina ran, most of them ran north, but some of them ran south instead, toward the one place on the map that no slave catcher was willing to follow them into. 1,000,000 acres of black water and cypress trees sitting right on the Virginia and North Carolina line. So thick that even a horse couldn't walk through it, and a dog really couldn't track a scent through it either. The men who hunted runaway slaves for a living would turn around at the edge of this swamp. But in 1823, Virginia sent in an armed militia in there with dogs to try to clear out the place, and they came back with almost nothing. The people who had made it inside didn't just hide out in there for a season. They actually built houses on dry ground, they cleared small fields, and they raised children who were born free in a slave state and grew up without ever once laying eyes on the outside world. Those families stayed in there for generations, and when they finally came out and gave their names to a census taker, the year was 1870, which happens to be the exact year that a whole lot of you cannot get past in your own family tree. Hi, I'm Danielle Romero, and thank you so much for being with me here on my channel where we talk about American identity and family stories. So here's where we're going with this video. We're going to start with what this swamp actually was. We're going to look at the words of the colonial officials who couldn't do anything about getting in there. And then we're going to get to the surnames. Those are the last names that may be connected to your family story, maybe not. And I have a document that lists all of that out for you guys. And then I'm going to give you the records that you can use to break through that 1870 wall that you might be stuck at. So let's get started. In the fall of 1856, a magazine illustrator named David Hunter Strother hired a guide, and he walked out into the Great Dismal Swamp. He had spent months hearing stories in Virginia parlors about the people who supposedly were still living inside the swamp, and he wanted to see one of them with his own eyes. The guide took him to a mound of dry ground somewhere near the Virginia-North Carolina border, and that guide knew exactly where he was going. There in the mound was a man, probably in his 40s. He was holding a long rifle across his chest, and Strother wrote that the man had stillness in his eyes. He said it was the kind that you would see in someone who's maybe been watching the woods for a very long time and who understands that the woods have been watching back. The man they found was named Osman, and that mound was his home. Strother sketched him right there on the spot, and Harper's Magazine actually printed this drawing the following year. So for one brief moment in 1857, the entire country got a clear look at a population it had never actually been able to catch or count. For more than 200 years, the government of Virginia and the government of North Carolina couldn't police this area, so they couldn't count the people that were hidden inside of it. So today I'm going to give you the surnames of the people that walked out of that swamp. I've got a printable page for you. It's free. I'll tell you how to get it later on in the video. And some of the records you can use to pursue your family. But for some of those last names, Bass, Weaver, Nickens, Bright, if any of those names run in your family or families you married into, this video is definitely for you. The earliest colonial voice that we have in this area belongs to a man named Alexander Spotswood, and he was serving as the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia. And he sat down in 1714 to write a report complaining about a stretch of land on his southern border. He called it, in his own words, a no man's land, where loose and disorderly people were flocking daily. So that's a sitting colonial governor 60 years before the American Revolution. And he's telling the crown, the British crown, on official paper that there's this population inside his own colony that his government cannot reach. And the people are there and they don't know what to do about it. So 14 years later, in 1728, a wealthy Virginia planter and surveyor named William Byrd II was hired to walk the exact line between Virginia and North Carolina. So the swamp sat squarely across that line. So he had actually sent crews into it. And he was like, go in there, write down what you find, bring it back to me. Byrd left us his journal, so you can read today. And in that journal, he described seeing families of what he called mulattoes sheltering in the interior. He wrote quite plainly that it is certain many slaves shelter themselves in this obscure part of the world. So before the Revolutionary War, before the Constitution, before this country even had a name, we were still a British colony, 2 colonial officials had already put on paper that there was this hidden population inside the swamp that the government couldn't get into. And this is an incredible story. So before the runaways and before the Maroons that Bird was writing about, the swamp belonged to indigenous people. Question I get in the comments constantly, people write in and tell me that their DNA either came back with native ancestry, sometimes a significant amount, and they cannot find a tribal roll or any records that kind of touch on that. And so then they'll be like, well, is the test wrong? But for some of you, I think the test is right, and there's this other part of your family story. So the Great Dismal Swamp had been a part of, a native community for a very long time. And archaeologists working inside the swamp have recovered stone tools that they were carbon dating back to roughly 13,000 years. So that puts continuous human use of that land basically to the edge of what we know about the peopling of America, of North America. And so by the early 1600s, the Algonquin-speaking tribes of the Virginia coastal plain, including the Chesapeake, the Nansemond, the Maroon, the Tuscarora, all had this working relationship with the swamp. And they used its islands and its hammocks for hunting, fishing, small plot agriculture. And they knew pathways through it that these colonial surveyors really could never find. They were being sent in there to document, but they would get in there and they didn't really know where to go. After the Third Anglo-Powhatan War ended in 1646, the Nansemond tribe had almost nothing left of their original River Valley land. And so by 1648, many of them simply picked up what they had and they just walked into the swamp. Because if you want to keep living traditionally and you don't want to leave your homeland behind, it was kind of like, well, let's just go to the nearest big swamp. And the Dismal Swamp was the biggest one on the continent. So maybe your first documented surname enters the story at this point. Because in 1638, an English minister by the name of John Bass married a woman named Elizabeth. But Elizabeth, despite her British-sounding name, was actually the daughter of a Nansemond chief. And the two of them had 8 children together. And that marriage was recorded in such a way that has survived all the centuries. That was in 1638. But what matters for your research, for your family, is that the Bass line stayed anchored to that Nansemond community, which is on the northern edge of the Great Dismal Swamp, for the next 380 years without really ever breaking. And their descendants used the paperwork of colonial Virginia to hold their ground, even as the state was trying to continuously redefine who they were. Now, 1677, we're so far back. This is the origin story here. The Treaty of Middle Plantation gave the Nansemond tribe and several other tribes the legal right to hunt and forage on their traditional grounds. Gee, thanks guys. And the Bass descendants used this treaty as a working tool. So in 1729, a man named William Bass, who was almost certainly the great-grandson of Elizabeth and John, he walked into a Virginia court and he cited this treaty from 1677, and he was able to claim 103 acres of cleared swampland in a place called Deep Creek, which is now Chesapeake, Virginia. So that land claim existed on paper in the courthouse. You can go read it today. And so the court accepted his argument that he had this connection to the tribal land, that as a Nansemond descendant, he had a legal right to that ground. So this is 90 years now before the United States of America exists as a country. There was already this family tribal claim to this swampland. Okay, so before the story about escaped slaves in the swamp even begins, we have already documented that the indigenous population used colonial courts and colonial treaties to anchor themselves at the edge of the water here, so to speak. And the population was intermarrying steadily over time with English settlers, with free Africans, with people who had liberated themselves from slavery, and they had come into the swamp for shelter. And every one of these bloodlines produced surnames that we are, almost all of us, can trace. We have a lot. So the second question I get asked all the time comes from people who have already done a lot of work on their family. They tell me they have an ancestor who shows up as a free person of color in one record, a laborer as somewhere else, then they vanish for a decade, then they reappear. This happens my family quite a bit on many branches of the family tree, and they want to know, are they chasing different people? Like, is this one person who keeps moving? Very often, when someone kind of disappears and then you think you found them later reappearing, you are chasing one person, and I want to explain why that person kept moving. Okay. So by the middle of the 1700s, this swamp had become something that historians now call a Maroon Colony. The way they're using it comes from a Spanish word cimarron, which was used for cattle that had escaped domestication and gone wild. Okay, kind of reminds me a little bit of the word mulatto, which means like mule. It's like they're using these words that really belong to animals, which I think, just as an aside, is kind of showing you the perspective of one group on another. And so this word was used for cattle that had escaped domestication, gone wild, and it eventually became used to describe people who had liberated themselves from slavery and built independent communities outside the plantation system. So you find these Maroon societies, or Maroon communities across the Americas. You find them in Jamaica, the interior of Brazil, and in between the border of Virginia and North Carolina. And the Great Dismal Swamp Maroon community, I think, is very likely the largest one that ever existed inside the boundaries of what is now the U.S. But this is a big deal. It's a big deal. It's a big part of the American story. So the best primary source we have on these dismal Maroons, as they're sometimes called, comes from a British traveler. And his name was John Ferdinand Smith. And he published a 2-volume book, like it was like big, in 1784. And it was called A Tour in the United States of America. Smith wrote that runaway Negroes have resided in these places for 12, 20, 30 years, upwards of that, more, subsisting themselves in the swamp upon corn, hogs, fowls that they raised on some of the spots that weren't perpetually underwater or constantly being flooded. And because most parts of the swamp were constantly flooding or being underwater. So it was not easy to do that, to raise animals or grow any plants. So Smith is describing at least 3 generation communities with permanent houses, cleared farmland, livestock, and they're running on like 1/50th of the swamp's ground that is reliably not going underwater. And he reports all of it just as an established fact from people who knew the place firsthand. So the population inside the swamp, though, kept growing from the late 1700s into the 1800s. And there's not really an exact number that we can give you because the entire point of it for these people is like to not be counted. So we don't have an exact number. And that proves that they were successful in their goal, right? So several historians have put it as high as 11,000 people living in and along the Dismal by 1860 across all of those Maroon sites combined. I've seen that upper figure be contested, and I don't know, but even historians who argue that it was less than that do describe that there's a population that was large enough that both states, Virginia and North Carolina, repeatedly tried to break it up and they couldn't. They failed. So in 1823, we're getting closer and closer to emancipation, okay? In 1823, our Virginia militia force went into the swamp with dogs specifically to hunt down and dismantle these Maroon settlements. And while they did destroy some structures, most of the residents kind of just, melted further into the interior and they rebuilt on new ground because they knew the swamp, and the militia did not. In 1847, so this is 24 years later, North Carolina jumps in and they pass a law written specifically to authorize the capture of Maroons in the Great Dismal Swamp. And that law failed to accomplish, obviously, what it was written to do. There were documented cases recorded in the memoirs of visitors and in interviews collected later by writers like Strother, who we talked about at the beginning of this video, of children born inside the swamp who grew into adulthood without ever laying eyes on a white person, and of grown adults who had never in their lives held a coin or seen a wagon wheel. So this brings us back to Osman. This was the man that Strother had sketched from real life in 1856. The engraving in Harper's Magazine is one of the very few visual records that we have of the Dismal Swamp Maroon Colony drawn by a witness. So Harriet Beecher Stowe actually read some of those same accounts, and she used them as source material for her second novel, which he titled Dread, A Tale of the Great Dismal Swamp. It's a great name, right? It has it's so evocative, right? It has such a dark feeling. And she published it the same year in 1856. Stowe's novel is fiction, so we're not going to read into it too much. But Strother drew Osman from real life, and that is that man. I'll put him on the screen. I mean, this is a real person. So who eventually came out of the swamp? What were their names, and what do we know about them? So the answer to that sits in the notebooks of a Smithsonian anthropologist named James Mooney. And he traveled to Norfolk County, Virginia in 1901. And he took a careful census of the Nansemond community that had been anchored there on the northern edge, remember, of the Great Dismal Swamp, continuously since Elizabeth and John Bass had married in 1638. So Mooney at that time counted 61 households. He photographed several of the families, and he wrote down every surname he encountered, and his list survives. I'm going to give it to you. I want to read it slowly, and I also will leave a link below in the comments and in the video description, or you can go to newyorktonashville.com and grab it's totally free, a downloaded one-page sheet for you of surnames from the Great Dismal Swamp and places you should look if you're researching this part of your family. So, these last names. This was from James Mooney, 1901. Bass, Bateman, Bond, Brady, Bright, Cable, Collins, Cragans, Gaylord, Gray, Green, Harmon, Holloway, Howard, Jones, Okay, Osborne, Porter, Price, Rowland, Sawyer, Scott, Sebastian, Simcoe, Weaver, White, Wilkins, and Williams. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, but this is the 61 households from that one community in 1901. This does not include surnames that were present in and around the swamp, but maybe they had drifted out of the Nansemond native community by the time Mooney arrived, which is why we would also add last names like Nickens, Trummel, Trammell, and Perkins, and there's many spelling variants your family may have picked up in the century since, because we know clerks were bad at spelling in every generation, and maybe our ancestors couldn't correct them or didn't know to correct them. The Trummel family of South Mills, North Carolina, and that is on the southern edge of the swamp. So the Nansemond tribe is the northern, this is on the southern edge. And that family descends from a man named Willis Bass and his wife Jemima Nickens, and they were both documented, though, as Nansemond people, and who record the births of their children in the pages of their family Bible, because they weren't getting recorded by the state of North Carolina. They were recording the stuff for themselves. And their daughter was named Lucinda Bass, and she married a man named William Trummel. So we have the Bass family and the Trummel family. And this is where a new line begins. It's called the Trummel line. It begins in South Mills, and the surname gets spelled a bunch of different ways. So you might see Trummel, Trammel, Trumbull, Trumbell, Trammel with one L. This is all the same family. Okay, let's jump to some more practical stuff. Knowing the history of the Great Dismal Swamp is amazing, but that's one thing. But sitting down at your computer and trying to figure out if your ancestors match up or what's going on, that is another. So let's talk about the 1870 census. So this was the first federal census taken after emancipation. So that means after the slaves were freed, this was the first time that we had a nationwide census that now included these people as their own households. And it was the first time that formerly enslaved people, along with previously uncounted populations of the Maroon and Indigenous border communities and all that, were written down by name as the heads of household in federal record. So what that means, if your ancestor appears in 1870 as a head of household in one of these 8 core Dismal Swamp communities, and they didn't appear on the 1860 slave schedule for those same counties, and they don't appear on the 1860 free population census either, then you're almost certainly looking at somebody who came out of the swamp or who came out of a similar community that had been living beyond the reach of the state. So I'm going to include the counties also on the worksheet for you, or the download. This list, you can download it, print it out, tape it above your research desk, take a screenshot, send it to your auntie, whatever. I think you'll be using it a lot if your family's from this area. If you believe that your family is part of this community, you might want to check out the Indiana Church at Bowers Hill, Virginia, which was a Nansemond community church, and that has Bass, Weaver, Nickens, Bright surnames kind of threaded like all through that stuff. There are similar county churches, or community churches, on the North Carolina side that you can look at, but church records, especially these smaller churches, obviously probably not a lot are digitized. I mean, I've definitely emailed and called churches just to kind of even see what they have. Sometimes I get a response, sometimes I don't, but you know, we're on the hunt here. So I know this is a lot to take in and a lot of sources, but again, if you have taken a commercial DNA test and it came back maybe showing native ancestry you can't match anywhere, and your family is anywhere near these counties or these areas that we've been talking about, this history could very likely be that reason. Because the Nansemond and the Maroon and the Chesapeake and some of these other coastal tribes were not on the Trail of Tears because they didn't go. They were on the Eastern federal rolls, and then the federal government didn't really recognize them, like for most of the 20th century. And then they were reclassified out of Indian identity on paper, which we've talked about many times, in 1924 in Virginia by Walter Plecker. So people that were listed as Indian, a lot of them were reclassified as colored. That was the Racial Integrity Act. And I'll link to that for this video if you haven't seen it yet. And that paperwork changed under our families. You know, it happened to them. And, you know, the families themselves never went anywhere. They didn't change. So something to keep in mind. The Great Dismal Swamp is a real place that you can drive to and stand at the edge of and look over the water of Lake Drummond. And I have not been there, but I have been to swamps in Louisiana where my family has lived as well. And you really can feel something tangible there in those places. How big and quiet a place would have to be for an entire community to disappear for 200 years, right? There are people alive today, you know, Bass descendants, Weaver descendants, Nickens descendants who trace their families back to that original 1638 marriage between Elizabeth and John, who they've known who they were the whole time. They've stayed in the same place basically the whole time. So if your tree hits that wall in 1870, understand that here in the U.S., our records are difficult, right? We're understanding and untangling that reason together here on this channel. Sometimes it was on purpose, like Walter Plecker. Sometimes it was just neglect or, you know, other motivations. But I think that changes our research, like when we're looking at it from that perspective of like, maybe our ancestors isn't like missing from the record. They just were not playing ball until 1870, right? So if your surname is anywhere on that Mooney 1901 list, or any of those things, or if your family came out of any of those counties that we talked about, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Do we need to do a part 2 to this? What did I miss? What would you like to add to this conversation for other people who are researching, and we'll read your comments as well. Tell me the earliest year you've been able to find your family too. We are rebuilding these maps together as a community on this channel. These maps of these multi-generationally mixed groups that hid for a long time. And now we as their descendants get to do this work, this really honorable work of finding our ancestors and remembering them. So every comment you do add about this adds a pin to that map, so to speak, that other researchers can use to then find their own people. And if you want to get the full, well, it's like one-page research guide for this, I will link to that below. And if you'd like to join me on Patreon, I put a ton of behind the scenes stuff, more information. It's easier for us to talk over there too. It supports the work I'm doing because a lot of the videos like this one will end up getting flagged or demonetized on YouTube. So come join me over at Patreon, or you could send me a coffee at coffee.com/NYTN13. I'm Danielle Romero. This is NYTN, and I'll see you in the comments.